Well, welcome back to our study of the book of Nehemiah. We have a couple more lessons in this, and in this lesson, we've kind of gotten to the point where we're kind of finishing up the Old Testament, just coincidental. And so, as I told you last time, we're going to spend a couple of lessons talking about what happened between the Old Testament and the New Testament. But let me say a prayer for us, and we'll dive right in. Lord, thank you for bringing us together, those online, those here. Thank you for our community and our open hearts and minds to study your word. Father, the world testifies about you, history testifies about you, and I pray, Lord, as we look into these things, that your truth would be revealed to us. Father, I pray for all those who can hear my voice, that your presence would be with them, for those who need healing. I pray that you would bring it for those who need comfort, for those who are anxious, for those who are in difficult circumstances. I pray for your presence. I also pray for our nation. I pray for our leaders, that you would turn their hearts toward you, Lord, and that all things will move to your will. In Christ's name, amen. Well, as usual, there's the question to text your questions in during class, and online, you should have the handout online as well. So, and that number's also on that. So we're going to just go chronologically. I want to go backwards just a little bit because I want to talk about prophecy a little bit, because there's no word from God in the 400 years between the Old Testament and the New Testament, but the prophecy right at the end of the Old Testament is very much impacts that 400 years. And I want to talk about prophecy in general and some in specific. But first, let's just look at a map and a timeline, and let's situate ourselves, since we're going to walk through this time period and the significance of it. Let's situate ourselves historically. So this map is a map of the Middle East in the time when the Babylonian Empire was ascendant. And so for our purposes, and by the way, all of my dates are going to be for our purposes in the Middle East. All right, so for our purposes, the Babylonians were ruling, and comes into our story about 605. And what happened was the Babylonian Empire, think Nebuchadnezzar is the big famous king in this time, probably the greatest king of the Neo-Babylonians. That's who they are. This is the second iteration of the Babylonian kingdom. So Nebuchadnezzar is conquering these lands and expanding his kingdom. And one of the things that he did was, obviously when he conquered a place, he wanted taxes. Everybody wants your taxes. They want, just plundering the area. They want the people to farm and so forth. They want them to be sustainable, but they don't really care about the standard of living of the people in Judea, which is what I'm going to call Israel in this time period. They don't care about the people in Israel or in Syria or in Persia or anywhere else. What they wanted is, you need at least to subsist, but all of your excess goes back to Babylon, and we're going to build great things. We're going to build sports theaters. We're going to have NFL teams. We're going to have all the best in Babylon, and you guys are going to be vassal states. And so we want taxes. Well, one of the ways that Nebuchadnezzar, and this is pretty bright, one of the ways that the Babylonians ensured that you paid your taxes was they would take prisoners. And they weren't prisoners like, I'm going to take them back to Babylon, I'm going to throw them in jail. They would take them back to Babylon, and they would do various things with them. I mean, they might put them to work, they might put them in college there. But the point is, if you didn't pay your taxes, you've got some important people in Babylon, and that still happens today. Daniel, a young Daniel and his friends, were a part of a group of Israelites, of Jews, that Nebuchadnezzar took back to Babylon with him. Now, if you remember, Daniel and his friends were young, probably in their teens, maybe 20, right around there, and they took them back, put them in Babylonian University, and were going to use them for the rest of their lives as civil servants. They would pay them, they'd have decent lives. They weren't slaves, they weren't mistreated, but they were going to take the best and the brightest of all these areas they've conquered, bring them back, teach them how to speak, Babylonian, worship the Babylonian gods, and work as civil servants, right? Daniel and his friends were caught up in that in 605 BC. So that's kind of where our story opens. And so Daniel, as long as we're here, let me just tell you I'm going to make a lot of sense out of the prophets at the end of the Bible. So Daniel is right here in Babylon, right? So he's right here. Ezekiel is going to be, he's in Jerusalem at this moment, but when the exile comes, he's going to be right here. And Jeremiah is not going to be taken away. He's going to be in Jerusalem when it's conquered. And so you can read about, these are books in your Bible. And so Jeremiah is a prophet. This is when he lived, and this is what he was talking about. Ezekiel is a wild prophet. He saw some crazy visions, but he was taken in the exile, and he lived near Babylon. By the way, Babylon today is Baghdad. So think about it today as being really close to Baghdad today. So these are three prophets at the end of your Old Testament, and this is when they lived, and this is what they talked about. So Daniel goes to Babylon when he's young. And so, needless to say, even though they had hostages or they had people there in Babylon, the Judean kings rebelled anyway. Very bad political move. I mean, it's the typical story. So Egypt comes to Jerusalem, talks to the Judean king and says, look, I know what you're paying the Babylonians, and my army's stronger than theirs. In fact, we're going to take this place over. And so I'll tell you what, I will defeat the Babylonians, and I'll give you my protection, and I'm going to cut it 25%. You only have to pay 75% of the taxes you're paying to those guys. And so the Judean king goes, hey, that sounds like a sweet deal to me. We're going to serve somebody. I'd like to get some extra money, right? And so he says, yes. Bad move. So Babylonians show up in 586 BC. This is a pivotal date in the history of the Jews. This is called the exile. Actually, you got to make sure you write on the slide. This is the exile. It's one of the two great formative events of the Jewish people. So 586, Nebuchadnezzar shows up. King of Jerusalem calls Egypt. They won't take his call. Egyptian king doesn't show up. The guy stiffs him, right? He doesn't show up. And so Nebuchadnezzar's mad. He said, look, I'm going to make you guys an example. And so he conquers the Jews. He knocks down the walls of Jerusalem. I mean, he takes great pains to knock down the walls of Jerusalem. He burns the temple and literally pulls all the stones out of the temple. And then he goes on social media, takes a few pics and says, don't let this happen to you, pay your taxes, right? This ancient form of intimidation, right? And so that's what he does. And so he takes the Jews, almost all of the Jews that are left there, takes them back and spreads them all over the Babylonian Empire. So they go over here. This is modern day Iran. This is modern day Iraq. This is getting up into Turkey. These are the stands over here, Kazakhstan, Turkmenistan, all the stands are over there. And so he spreads them all around. And this is called the exile of the Jews. So I want you to hold Daniel in your mind, but let's go on through this. So in 539, the Persians conquer Babylon. And so when the Persians conquer Babylon, we're going to talk about all this, but this is part of our Nehemiah story. The Persians conquer Babylon, and they have a different strategy. They're like, we also want taxes, but we really don't care if you live in your hometown. We really don't care if you worship your gods. All we want is the tax money. And so Cyrus says, you Jews can go back. And so the Jews begin to go back. And in different waves, they go back. And notice here that in 458, Ezra goes back to Jerusalem. He's a priest. You can read about that in the book of Ezra in the Old Testament. And then in 444 BC, our friend Nehemiah goes back to Jerusalem. You can read about that in the book of Nehemiah. And he rebuilds the walls. And so we just finished talking about Nehemiah's story, and I want you to see historically when it's happening. And it's happening when the Persians have conquered the Babylonians, okay? So I want to go back to Daniel. Daniel, and because I want to talk about the 400 years between the Old and New Testament, and Daniel has a lot to say about that. Actually, God has a lot to say about that through Daniel. So Daniel is living in this whole time period. So he is taken to Babylon in 605, and now he's still there in 539 when the Persians conquer. So he serves Nebuchadnezzar. He's an advisor to all of the Babylonian kings, and he is a top advisor to the Persian kings when he comes in. So Daniel lives through this whole time period. In 605, he's a young man. In 539, he's an old man. Now, I want to go to the book of Daniel, and I want to give you a prophecy from early in his life and one from right at the end of his life. So that's where we're going now. So at the very beginning of going to Babylon, Daniel has a vision, and this is a vision that he communicates to Nebuchadnezzar the king. So think somewhere in 605, 600, somewhere around there. And this is his vision, because the king Nebuchadnezzar has had a dream, and he's going to interpret it. He said, "O king, you looked in your dream, and there in front of you stood a large statue, an enormous, dazzling statue, awesome in appearance. Now the head of this statue was made of pure gold, but its chest and arms were made of silver, and its belly and its thighs were made of bronze, and its legs were made of iron, and its feet were part iron and part clay. Now, while you were watching this statue in your dream, a rock was cut out of a mountain, but not by human hands, and it struck the statue on its feet of iron and clay, and it smashed them. Then the iron and the clay and the bronze and the silver and the gold were all broken to pieces and became like dust on the threshing floor. And so the wind swept them away without leaving a trace. But the rock that had struck the statue became a huge mountain and filled the whole earth. This was the dream that you had." And Nebuchadnezzar goes, "Wow, you're right. That is the dream that I had." He said, "And now we will interpret it to the king. You, O king, are the king of kings." This is Nebuchadnezzar he's talking to. "The God of heaven has given you dominion and power and might and glory. In your hands he has placed mankind and the beasts of the field and the birds of the air." In other words, you are ruler over most of the known world. "Wherever they live, he has made you ruler over them all. You are the head of gold. After you die, another kingdom is going to rise, and it will be inferior to yours. It won't be gold, it'll be silver. Next, a third kingdom, one of bronze, will rule over the whole earth. Finally, there'll be a fourth kingdom, strong as iron, because iron breaks everything. And as iron breaks things to pieces, so this empire will crush and break all the others. But just as you saw that the feet and toes were partly of clay and partly of iron, so this will be a divided kingdom. It'll be a little fragile, yet it will have some of the strength of iron in it. And so this kingdom will be partly strong and partly brittle. And so in the time of those kings, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom that will never be destroyed, nor will it be left to another people. It will crush all the kingdoms that came before it and bring them to an end, but it will endure forever. This is the meaning of the vision of the rock cut out of the mountain, a rock that broke the iron, bronze, clay, and silver and gold to pieces." So you may be familiar with this. This is a dream that Nebuchadnezzar had. Daniel, it's a great story. Read the book of Daniel. And he comes in and he interprets it by God's power and he explains it. And what he's saying is, I'm going to tell you what's going to happen in history. You are the first great kingdom that God has established in this time. And there are going to be 3 more kingdoms after you. Let's fast forward a little bit. And near the end, now we're in Daniel 7, not Daniel 2, and we fast forwarded about 50 years. And so now Belshazzar is the king of Babylon. He's the last king of Babylon. He's the one that the Persians conquer. And so he also has a dream. And these visions that Daniel had passed through his head. And here is a vision that he had. He said, "There before me were the 4 winds of heaven churning up the great sea. And 4 great beasts, each different from the others, came up out of the sea." Just using kind of, if you've done our Revelation series, you'll know that kind of the symbology of coming out of the sea is we're talking about political earthly kingdoms. And sure enough, that's the case. The first beast was like a lion, had the wings of an eagle. And I watched until its wings were torn off, and it was lifted from the ground so that it stood on 2 feet like a man, and the heart of a man was given to it. And there before me was a second beast, which looked like a bear. It was raised up on one of its sides, and it was chewing these 3 ribs in its mouth. And after that I looked, and there before me was another beast, and this one looked like a leopard, and on its back it had 4 wings like those of a bird. This beast had 4 heads, and it was given authority to rule. And then I saw a fourth beast, terrifying, frightening, very powerful. It had large iron teeth. It crushed and devoured its victims and trampled underfoot whatever was left. It was different from all the former beasts, and it had 10 horns. And while I was thinking about the horns, there was another little horn which came up among them. Okay, so I'll stop there and I'll say there have been so many books written about this, it isn't funny. I mean, so many trees have died to write theories about this prophecy. But the general meaning of this prophecy is very easy to understand. It's not disputed, and these are the visions that he saw. So on the left, you see the dream about the statue with the gold, the silver, the bronze, and the iron. And on the right, you see the 4 beasts. Now, like I say, people want to micromanage this prophecy, but the fundamental idea of this prophecy is he's talking in each one of these cases. God is forecasting 4 great kingdoms, and I'll tell you what they are. The first kingdom is Babylon. We know that. Daniel told Nebuchadnezzar, "You are the head of gold." The second is the kingdom of Persia, from 539 to 331. Now remember, between the testaments is from about 400 BC to 0, that 400-year period. So you have the Persians, then Greece from 331 to 168 BC, and then Rome from 168 BC to, long story, but the part we care about, fell in 476 AD. So this prophecy that Daniel is having in about 600 BC, this is God telling you what's going to happen politically in that time period. And sure enough, it ticks off exactly like they said. These kingdoms do come and rise and fall, and they do so for very specific purposes. So what I want to talk about briefly, it's not our main point, and I'll get on, but I really want to just talk about prophecy for a minute. Prophecy today, by Christians and non-Christians alike, is often treated as a roadmap to the future. And if only you understood it, you could profit on the stock market, or you could know what's happening, or whatever. But if you stop and think about Christian prophecy, at least, has a very specific purpose, and it is not to satisfy our curiosity. So why would God give to Daniel and forecast what's going to happen? Nobody in Daniel's time understood this. I mean, they kind of got it, like, oh, well, you're clearly talking about kingdoms. We know the symbology, but we don't know what the kingdoms are going to be. I mean, when Daniel utters the prophecy, they don't know that the Persians are going to conquer. They don't know anything about Alexander the Great. They sure don't know anything about the Romans at that time. But they do know that God is saying certain things are going to happen. And then over the next few centuries, as those things happen, people realize God said this was going to happen. The purpose of prophecy in this case is God demonstrating that he is sovereign over political events. When I say political, I mean temporal, ruling powers, that kind of a thing. God is going to demonstrate to his people, as these things unfold, you will remember that I told you this. Well, either God is just a great predictor, or God is pulling the strings. And so the whole point of prophecy is for us to know that God is sovereign. And human beings behave in a manner of free will. So here's how I'd like you to think about this. This is like you have an orchestra, and everybody in the orchestra has different music. And so you got some violinists, and they're playing Pachelbel's Canon, right? And you got the the guys on the tuba, they're playing the OSU fight song. Everybody's playing a different tune. And it's as though, so they are doing what they want to do. And God is the conductor. And even though they're all playing that song, when you stand up there at the conductor, you go, I don't know how this happened, but that sounds great. In other words, the conductor orchestrates this so that it turns out to be the song that God wants played. Does that make any sense? That is a great way to think about God's sovereignty and its interaction with human will. I don't want to say free will, because I don't think anybody in this room actually, if you think about it a minute, believes in free will. We believe in a freed will, but not free will. But the point is that we have choices to make. And so, but God is sovereign. So how do you know that Cyrus is going to decide to conquer Babylon? Well, that's because that's what Cyrus wants to do. But God knew ahead of time exactly how this is going to play out. So the purpose of prophecy, and this is still true today when you look at Revelation, the purpose of prophecy is God saying, I know things look difficult in your life, but I am pulling the strings. This is all going where I decide it's going to go. That's really comforting to us, because if you stop and think about this, that's just as true today as it was then. And we'll talk more about that in a little bit. But I wanted you to understand this prophecy of Daniel, because God's not going to speak to his people in that 400 years, but he's already laid out a roadmap for them. So in that time period, the Jews knew our God is still king of the universe. And this is how they knew it. So let's talk again. This is just a little different way to get the history in your head. These are just the events we care about. So you have Babylon. And so Babylon's purpose, I want you to think about it in this way. God came to his people and he gave them, and this is true all through the Old Testament, he said, keep my rules and give me your faith and don't go after other gods, and I will bless you. We have a covenant. I'll be your God, you'll be my people. If you go after other gods, they will fail you. Bad things are going to happen. They went after other gods. Sure enough, bad stuff happens. And so Babylon becomes the agent of God for the exile of the Jews, which he has told them for 200 years that there are consequences to their action. This is huge. And so Babylon, now Nebuchadnezzar doesn't know that his purpose in God's plan is to exile the Jews, but that was God's plan. And in fact, the only prophet I didn't mention is Isaiah. He spoke 100 years before this stuff happened, and he said this is what's going to happen to you. The Persians, their job was not exile, their job was return. So you have the exile, which God also prophesied. If you turn to me, you can return. Remember Nehemiah's prayer? At the very beginning of the book, he goes to God, he said, God, I want to confess to you, I have not been faithful to you, my fathers have not been faithful to you, but you did say that if we turned our hearts back to you, you would gather us out of exile and bring us back. And sure enough, that's exactly what they said. And so he goes to Jerusalem. God blesses him to be able to build the walls. The Jews start coming back. And sure enough, as we get to the end of the Old Testament, the Jews are coming back, the return, just as God had prophesied. Then we're going to meet the Greeks, and they're going to show up in 331, and they're going to be around this part of the world, Judea, until the Romans show up in 63. And the big piece of this is Antiochus is the king we care about. We want to talk about Alexander the Great, and then we want to talk about Antiochus. And then finally, these are the four kingdoms. You get Rome. Rome's going to rule from 63 BC, when Pompey conquers Judea, until well into the early church age. You're going to see the birth of Jesus during the time of the rule of Rome, and the Romans are going to destroy the temple, and it's still destroyed. I mean, it's like it's gone then, and it's still not there today. So that's the prophecy of the time of between the two testaments. And so we begin with the Babylonian Empire and Daniel and his friends. And near the end of the Babylonian Empire, I want you to see the handoff, what happens here, and how God has a hand in reversing the exile. So King Belshazzar, he's the last Babylonian king, gave a great banquet for 1,000 of his nobles. And while Belshazzar was drinking wine, he gave orders to bring the gold and silver goblets that Nebuchadnezzar, his father, not his literal father, his great-grandfather, so 50 years earlier, right? That he had brought from the temple before he destroyed it. He took all the good stuff out of it. And so they're drinking wine from that, and they brought in the golden goblets, and his wives and his concubines drank from them. And they praised the gods of gold and silver, bronze, iron, wood, and stone. And so suddenly, the fingers of a human hand appeared, this is in the book of Daniel, chapter 5, and wrote on the wall. And they write this particular phrase on the wall, and as you would expect, Belshazzar, he's probably got a buzz. But anyway, he's scared to death. I mean, he sees this happening. He goes, something's happening, probably not good. And so he sees the writing on the wall. It says his knees knocked together and his legs gave way. So, by the way, this is a side note. You notice that the Babylonians have served God's purpose. They didn't intend to serve God's purpose, but they fulfilled his prophecy. They don't even know his prophecy. But the Jews go into exile. And now God judges the Babylonians. In other words, just because they did God's will doesn't mean they're God's people. And so they're going to be destroyed. And so, king called out all the enchanters and astrologers and said, whoever reads this writing will be clothed in purple, have a gold chain placed around his neck. And all the king's wise men came in, but they couldn't read the writing. They couldn't tell the king what it meant. So Belshazzar became more terrified, and his face grew more pale, and his nobles were baffled. But Daniel answered the king. I'm fast forwarding a little bit. He said, he's an old man now, and you can do this stuff when you're an old man. Now, when he was a kid, remember when he said that Nebuchadnezzar, O king, live forever, this is what's going to happen? He's an old guy now. It's like, get off my lawn. I don't care about your stuff. And so he speaks to Belshazzar, and he's like, Belshazzar, you're not a tenth of your great-grandfather Nebuchadnezzar, which is true. Belshazzar's having this feast, by the way, while the Persian army is besieging Babylon. He just thinks there's no way they can take this city. This guy's terrible ruler. His approval ratings down in the 20s and 30s. Anyway, so, O king, the Most High God gave your father Nebuchadnezzar greatness and glory and splendor. Because of the high position he gave him, all the peoples of the earth dreaded and feared him. He put to death who he wanted to put to death. Those he wanted to spare, he spared. So he's basically saying, you're not half the man he was. And so then he moves on. But you, his son, O Belshazzar, have not humbled yourself, even though you knew all this. Instead, you have set yourself up against the Lord of heaven. You had the goblets from his temple brought in, and you and your nobles drank from them. You praised the gods of silver and gold, which cannot see or hear or understand, but you did not honor the God who holds in his hand your very life. Therefore, he sent the hand to write this. And this is what these words mean. God has numbered the days of your reign and brought it to an end. So who's sovereign here? You have been weighed on the scales and found wanting, and your kingdom is divided and given to the Medes and the Persians. And on that very night, the Persians conquered the city of Babylon. There was actually, the river ran through the city of Babylon, and what they had been doing while Belshazzar was feasting was they dug some, this is historical, this bears itself out in history. They dug some channels and dammed up the river, and so it quit flowing. And when it quit flowing, they just walked in and conquered the city. And so that happened on that night. And so the Persians take over. And so just as Daniel's prophecy said, in 539 BC, you get the Persians, the Medes and the Persians, but think Persians, think Iranians, and think Babylon, think Iraqis. And so they cover this area, but I want you to see how big this Persian empire is. And so from 539 all the way down until, think over 200 years, till Alexander the Great shows up. The Persians rule everything. I mean, this is when a lot of historical stuff happens that you know about. They don't conquer Greece, but they conquer, look at this, all the way into India, all the way up into Russia. I mean, they conquered just unbelievably. Obviously, they conquered Egypt. They didn't conquer Greece because of the 300, right? The Spartans, the naval battles, that kind of thing. That's all happening in this time period. And so the Persians have conquered this area. Cyrus was the first Persian king, and this is just the Cyrus cylinder, which comes from 539 BC. This is Cyrus writing on there. Oh, did I mention that I defeated the Babylonians? This is ancient Facebook, is what this is. It's like, set these up all around the place. If you can read it, you know that I, Cyrus, conquered the Babylonians. Nobody saw that coming. I'm awesome, king of the year, kind of stuff. But what's interesting about this, and I didn't bring this text, but so the Persians are going to rule from basically 539 till 331-ish, right? So over 200 years. But Cyrus shows up in 539, 160 years earlier. His name is in the book of Isaiah. Isaiah prophesied 160 years before this happens. And it's an interesting prophecy. He says, Cyrus, God says, will be my Messiah, which just means the anointed one. Cyrus will be one that I'm going to anoint to bring my people back. And that's exactly what happens. So I'm not telling you this so you think, oh, prophecy's so cool. God can predict stuff. Maybe he'll predict something for me. Wrong point. The point is, God knows what's going to happen because God is the orchestrator. He is the conductor of what's going on here. And that's a powerful idea. So Cyrus is the great king. What does Cyrus do? In the first year of Cyrus, king of Persia, this is 538, very next year, in order to fulfill the word of the Lord spoken by Jeremiah. Jeremiah had prophesied that there will come a king and he will let you go back. The Lord moved the heart of Cyrus, king of Persia, to make a proclamation throughout his realm. This is what Cyrus, king of Persia, says. The Lord, the God of heaven, has given me all the kingdoms of the earth. He's not a believer, so don't let this fool you. And has appointed me to build a temple for him at Jerusalem in Judah. Any one of his people among you, may the Lord his God be with him and let him go up. So what's he saying? You guys go home if you want to. In fact, I'm going to help you rebuild your temple because I think your God's like a serious God. Now, he believes in a lot of gods, but he thinks this God of the Jews, you don't want to fool with this guy, right? And so I'm going to help build his temple. So I don't want you to think that he's a godly man, but he's marching to God's tune, isn't he? That's still true today as well. So Cyrus does, they go back. This is what we've been studying. And so Zerubbabel in 538 takes a group of people back to Jerusalem, and they're just doing the best they could. And then later, 458, Ezra the priest comes back and starts helping them build a temple and do some worship and reinstitute it. Then, of course, in 445, Nehemiah comes back, builds the wall, becomes the governor, and the Jews become good. And that all happens in this time. And then the Old Testament goes silent. But the prophecy keeps rolling on. And so in 356, now we're just into regular history at this point, but it's all history that God mapped out for this time period. So Alexander the Great is born. He's born not in Greece per se, he's born in the north, in Macedonia, but think he's a Greek. And so he only lives 33 years, but really interesting guy because Alexander conquers so much of the known world. This is a map of what Alexander conquered. And just to give you a timeline, he starts when he's very young. His father, Philip, is killed, but he conquers Judea, Israel. That's why I put this on my map. He conquers that area in 331 BC. So he's 25 years old when he conquers this. He goes down, he conquers Egypt, and then he goes and he conquers most of the rest of the Persian Empire, all the way into India, etc. And he dies from disease when he's 33 years old. And so he's literally conquered this kingdom. Why is Alexander the Great important in our story? So each one of these kingdoms has a role to play. So the first kingdom, Babylon, that Daniel prophesied about, their role was to execute God's discipline, his punishment, what he told was going to happen to the Jews, and they are taken away into exile. The next kingdom, the Persians, just like God said 70 years later, their role, they don't know this, they're just conquering, right, is to bring the Jews back. And sure enough, under the Persian Empire, they come back. Nehemiah builds the wall. The Jews, they're back, and they've got their homeland. Now, in this prophecy, between the testaments, the vision turns forward, not getting the Jews back, but it turns forward. And Alexander the Great's empire, its purpose in God's plan is to begin to prepare the way for Jesus. So God has fulfilled his commitments to the Jews. He said, you're going to go into exile. If you turn your hearts back to me, I'll bring you back. Babylonians, Persians are how God chose to accomplish that. And there they are. And now God says, but I also made some promises to you, some prophecy about a kingdom that will never end. Remember that rock that's going to destroy the fourth kingdom? And so now, Alexander the Great's kingdom, Alexander the Great just thinks he's becoming Alexander the Great. He started out as Alexander the Pretty Good, then he became Alexander the Great, and he comes down in history, and we all know him. That's what he thinks is going on. What God thinks is going on is, now I'm going to go work on the next promise, and I'm going to start preparing the world. How does Alexander the Great prepare the world for Jesus? He does one really important thing. He spreads Greek culture everywhere he goes. That's not necessarily true of the Babylonians. They just want your taxes. And it's not true of the Persians. They also just want your taxes. You don't even have to worship our gods if you don't want to. Alexander, though, the Greeks thought that their culture, their language, their gods, their civilization was better than anybody else's. And he took with him not just soldiers, he took philosophers with him, he took teachers with him, and he left soldiers, Greek people, all throughout this place. He took teachers, he took artists, he took philosophers, and spread them all over. He wasn't just trying to conquer the world, he was trying to Hellenize the world. The word Hellenize comes from the word Hellas. The Greeks didn't think they were Greeks. Their word was Hellas. So we call it Greece, they called it Hellas. So they were called the Hellenes. So to Hellenize the world meant to make it Greek. And they taught them how to speak Greek language, and because from 331 all the way down until the time of the Romans in 63, so think about over 250 years, Greeks ruled this whole area. Greek became the international language. The Greek money in the New Testament, the money that they talk about, a drachma, a tetradrachma, those are Greek coins. And so they literally spread that culture everywhere. Well, how does that help? It's a pagan culture. Yes, it is, but your New Testament is written in Greek. And the reason it's written in Greek is everybody can speak Greek at this time, because for over 250 years, the Greeks have ruled the world. They know about their culture. They know about the Greek gods. Even the Romans, when they show up, they're so culturally bankrupt. Some people are going to argue with me about this, but fundamentally, they just borrowed the Greek gods. They borrowed the Greek poetry. They were good engineers and they were good soldiers, but they didn't do well in school. And so they copied off the Greeks, right? Alexander the Great, interesting guy. You may remember this, but some of the great names in Greek philosophy, think Aristotle and Plato and Socrates. Aristotle was his tutor. And so Alexander the Great is introduced not just to the world of warfare, and he's really a natural at warfare, but he's also introduced to the idea of Greek philosophy and thinking and reasoning. It's an intellectual explosion of the Greeks around this time period. And so you see what happens here with Alexander. So the purpose that God is using this for is to start to pave the way for the time of Christ. Well, Alexander dies young. So what happens to his empire? And this becomes very important to us. Do you remember, you probably don't remember this, but if you remember in the beasts that the leopard, which is the Greek empire of Alexander, has 4 heads. And that's because when Alexander dies, he has no succession plan. He's only 33. He's not planning to retire anytime soon, but he gets sick and he dies. 4 of his generals divide up his kingdom. And I don't care about all of them. I really only care about 2 of them. And so notice that Seleucus was one of his generals, and in the green area, he took all of that. Ptolemy is another one of his generals, and he took all of this area. He took Judea, Israel, he took Egypt, and then you've got some others out in the west, and they do not factor into our story. But there were 4 generals that divided up that empire. They're all Greeks, and they continue to Greek culture, but they're fighting with each other a lot. But you have still this Hellenic influence for over 250 years. Well, the 2 guys that we care about, Ptolemy makes his own empire. And when I say empire, what do I mean? It means his kid became king, his kid became king, his kid became king. That's an empire. It's a dynasty, if you will. Seleucus also made a dynasty. His kid became king, his kid became king. And so this is called the Ptolemaic dynasty or empire, and this is called the Seleucid empire or Seleucid dynasty. This matters because these guys fought like cats and dogs. And so right here, and this is really interesting, of all the places on the earth, Israel, or Judea at that time, is right where most of their battles happened. It's right in between the 2 big empires. Now stop and think about this. This is really interesting to me, is that Judea has nothing going for it. It's not the prettiest place in the world. It's not the most profitable place in the world. It just happens to be geographically located through all of history between 2 great empires. They wouldn't even have been in the newspaper if they hadn't have existed right between these empires. They were always between Egypt and Babylon, Egypt and the Persians. Now they're between the Seleucid Empire and the Ptolemaic Empire. They're always in the middle of what's going on, and consequently, they became very influential, way more influential than their size. The Jews have always been historically more, I'm talking now, forget religion for a minute. They're influential spiritually because God is God. But they've been influential historically because they've been in the center of events. They're still in the center of events. I mean, seriously, just step back and undo your conditioning. Why in the world do we even talk about Israel today? They don't have oil. They don't have anything going except they're in the center of world events still. And I want to make this one point to you. The successor to Israel of being in the middle of world events, and I'm not talking about successor of Israel in a religious sense. What I mean is, who is in the center of discussions in America today in our culture? I want you to think about this for a minute. So God's people, the Jews, were in the middle of world events for a lot of history. Who is in the middle of most of what's going on in America today? The Christians are in the middle. Why not the Muslims? They're just not. Why not the Jews? They're just not. Why not the Baha'i people? They're just not. Why not the secular humanists? They're just not. If you pick up a paper, when people are arguing and people are fighting, what are they fighting about? We don't like the Christians. Why? I mean, are we bad citizens or something? No, we're not. But isn't it interesting that God's people, God has placed his people in the middle of events. And so when you look back at history, you can see Israel and you think, how unlikely that they were in the middle of big events. You look at us and you say, how unlikely, but God's people are still in the middle and influencing world events. So they fight and they fight, and the Seleucids win. They win this territory. They don't defeat the Ptolemies, but they win this territory, and so they kind of get the upper hand. By the way, the Ptolemies are going to go off into history when the Romans show up, but you actually know a very famous Ptolemy. And so you get Ptolemy, the original, was one of the generals, and then their kids weren't named Ptolemy, but it's still called the Ptolemaic dynasty. Cleopatra was a Ptolemy. So she has Greek background as well as Egyptian. And so the last Ptolemaic ruler is going to be Cleopatra. And then, of course, she's going to have that fling with Caesar, and some say Rome conquered Egypt, some say Cleopatra conquered Caesar. We'll get to that next week. But bottom line, you know a little bit about this, but for our purposes, the Seleucids end up being the ones who are controlling this area. And so as we get closer to Jesus, it turns out that this desire to Hellenize the world gets taken to extremes. While Alexander wasn't oppressive, he just wanted everybody to learn Greek. He wanted everybody to know their philosophy because it was a superior philosophy. Much like the Chinese today, by the way. If you really want to understand China's posture in the world, it's a little bit like this, and that is, we want to enlighten the rest of the world that our way of life is better than anybody else's. Well, that's what he thought. But one of the successors, and this is on down the road, so think Alexander the Great, 331, died in 323, right? And then his 4 generals take over, and Seleucus, one of his kids rules, then one of his kids rules, and you finally get to a guy named Antiochus, and he is descended from Seleucus, and he's ruling that Seleucid empire, so you see it all in green. And he is the ruler, and he rules from 175 to 164, and he had a really outsized influence. And the reason he has an outsized influence is he decided, I'm going to do something even better than Alexander. I'm not just going to have Greek language and Greek influence here. I'm going to have everybody turn into Greeks, and they're going to worship the Greek gods, and they're going to give up their gods. And that worked pretty well everywhere in the empire except the Jews. And so when Antiochus got to the Jews, he said, it's against the law anymore to sacrifice in your temple. It's against the law to read your book. In fact, why don't you bring those Old Testaments, bring your Torahs, we're going to burn them. In fact, it's a capital punishment to have a copy of your Bible. And so he begins to try to stamp out that religion. He even thinks that he has delusions of grandeur, and he thinks he's a god. This is a coin. This is a pic, by the way. And this literally is a pic. I mean, it's probably a flattering pic. It's probably been photoshopped. But this coin was made when he was alive. That is a picture of Antiochus IV, whom we call Antiochus Epiphanes. And on the back side, this is him sitting on his throne. And in Greek, this says, the king Antiochus Epiphanes. Epiphanes was a term in those days that meant the virtual manifestation of the God. I want you to file this in the back of your head because it's going to sound really like, oh my gosh, this sounds really interesting. What he was saying is, I am the human form of an Olympian god. I literally am a god. And so he thought, really highly of himself. I don't know if you've been on LinkedIn anytime soon. There are some pretty impressive titles on LinkedIn, the business social network site, but none that, by the way, I am a god. Okay, I haven't seen that one yet, probably going to be out there soon. And then it says victory. And so coins, by the way, in that day, that's the only time anybody would even see him most of the time is here's his picture, and it's on the coin. And on the back would be a little propaganda like, I'm the victor. Nobody can beat me. Did I mention I was a god? And I am the king, right? And so this is Antiochus Epiphanes. And what he begins to do is he begins to persecute the Jews brutally. I mean, brutally. I'll read you a little bit, just the part that's rated PG in our next lesson. Because during this time, what's happening with the Jews is very interesting. And so the Jews are enduring this persecution. So God's purpose, and I want to make this point as well, God's purpose is being fulfilled, not because the Greeks are good people or they want to serve God, but God is getting the world ready for Jesus Christ. Because we've got one widespread culture, we've got one language. You want to spread the gospel? It'd be nice to have a common language, wouldn't it? The Apostle Paul, who's going to travel to all these places, you know what he speaks? Well, he speaks Hebrew. He speaks Latin. That's really helpful because that's the kind of official language. But he speaks Greek, and he writes in Greek because everybody can understand it. And so the gospel spreads like wildfire because there's no translations. Everybody can understand this. And so they're getting the world ready for that. But God's people are paying a price nonetheless. And God's judgment is going to come, once again, on this empire as well. So, for our story, and I'll pause there, because a couple of things are happening at this time, and this is what we're going to pick up in the next lesson, is during this time, the Jews are writing some books. There's no inspired message from God, but this is when the Apocrypha is written. This time period under the Greeks between the Testaments. You know some of the Apocrypha, the books of Maccabees are part of the Apocrypha, and I'm going to quote out of that. The books of the Maccabees record the history of this time, of this period, under Antiochus Epiphanes trying to destroy the religions of the Jews. You get some crazy, interesting books like Enoch, which tells you all about angels. All those books, by the way, that are in your Catholic Bible that are not in your Protestant Bible, they were written during this time. They're not inspired by God, but they were written during this time. And we're going to reference some of those so we can see firsthand what's happening during that time. This is when, by the way, the Pharisees start. Sadducees will be along later. But the Pharisees, let me put it this way. When we get to the end of the next lesson, you're going to like the Pharisees a little bit better than you do now. They're still bad guys, but they're going to be heroes next week because anybody that can stand up to Antiochus Epiphanes is a hero. So, interesting parallel. There's all kinds of parallels here. And another parallel is the Jews are going to suffer, and you know why they're going to suffer in this time period? Because they won't bow down to the gods of the culture. The Christians, in a couple hundred years, are going to suffer, and between the time of about 90 AD until 313 AD, over 200 years, Christians are going to be killed in the tens of thousands. Why? Because they will not bow down to the Roman gods, the gods of the culture. And today, we're not being put to death for being Christians, but the same ultimatum is going to come to us. It has all through time, and that is, will you bow down to the gods of the culture? And if you say no, there will be a price. But here's what I want you to remember. Just as God and God's people outlasted the Babylonians, and God and God's people outlasted the Persians, and they outlasted the Greeks, and they outlasted the Romans, and we will outlast all the other kingdoms of the earth as well. Because whether they know it or not, they are dancing to the tune that God is conducting in the world. And so I want to pause here, and we'll finish this story next time, but what I want you to take away is this fundamental idea. As we're walking through this intertestamental period, God has already forecast what's going to happen. And even though these rulers and the kings and the empires are about their business in the world, what you and I can see looking back, and that's why that prophecy was made, was for us to look back, is to realize, actually, they think they're running the show. But this is all playing out exactly the way God said it would play out. Fast forward to your life, my life, our individual lives, our lives in America, our lives in the world. There are empires and there are forces and political parties and rulers who are having their way in the world. You can be just as sure today as they were then that God is actually the one who is orchestrating what's happening. Romans 8:28, in all circumstances, God works for the good of those who love him. That was true in Babylon, it was true in Persia, it was true in the Greeks and in the Romans, and it's still true today. So I want you to have hope as you look to the future. Next time, we're going to talk about Antiochus Epiphanies and the Maccabees and trying to stamp out the Jews. Then the Romans are going to arrive on the scene. The Greeks prepared the world with the culture, and there's one more thing that has to happen before Christ can come, and that's what the Romans are going to bring. And we'll talk about that next time. Thanks, guys.